Thank you all so much for joining our discussion today. My name is Michael Lavers. I'm the international news editor for the Washington and Los Angeles Blades. And it's a real honor for me to have a chance to speak with our wonderful panelists today to talk about Pride and what that looks like around the world. So I'll do some very brief introductions and then we'll just go ahead and jump right into it. So I'm really happy to welcome Hazel Mogati from Botswana. She is the managing director of African Women for Sexual Health and Gender Justice. So Hazel, thank you so much for joining us today. And secondly, Glenn Roy Murray. He's the Director of Strategy and Impact for Equality for All Foundation in Jamaica. So Glenn Roy, thank you so much for joining us. And our third panelist will hopefully be Naomi Fontanos. She is the Executive Director of Gender and Development Advocates Ganda Filipinas in the Philippines. And we look forward to welcoming her as well. So I'm going to start with Hazel. And so Hazel, just talk to us about what Pride this year looks like in Botswana and what sorts of events, whether they're in person or virtual, that your organization has planned. Hazel? Looks like we might have lost her. So Glenn Roy, I'll go to you and hopefully we can get Hazel back. So talk about what Pride looks like in Jamaica this year, whether there's in-person events or virtual events. What is Pride going to look like on the island this year?
So we usually have our Pride celebrations in August as opposed to June or July. So August 1 to 6 in Jamaica is the period of emancipation and independence. So emancipation when enslavement ended within the British colonial context, and independence when Jamaica became an independent country. And we cannot see queer liberation and LGBT rights along that path of emancipation. So that's where we generally have our Pride, to kind of localize the conversation and to kind of reaffirm the message that we're Jamaicans just like everyone else. So last Pride, we had a virtual Pride. Well, there was a small hub, and then we with a range of activities that we streamed online. Currently, because with COVID, the restrictions change on an ongoing basis. Based on the last update we got from the Prime Minister, it looks like it's going to be virtual, and so that's where the plans are going. So having another hub-based event, hopefully we're trying to see if we can get a bigger audience this time for some of the events, and have that for the week of Pride and stream it online. We're also doing this initiative that we call Pride Share to kind of encourage greater participation of a wider range of community members this year in our annual Pride celebrations. And we've been doing it for 6 years, and now we've had partners and supporters in different spheres, whether it's private sector, whether it's just community-based actors. We want to kind of now decentralize Pride. We kickstarted it, and now we want more and more persons, so it doesn't continue in this flair of it being a J-flag event or equality event, but everyone's event.
And who would normally attend a J-flag Pride celebration? Obviously, this year's a little different because we're still in the pandemic, but in non-pandemic years, who would attend Pride? Would it be like local community members? Would it be perhaps local elected officials? I know the mayor of Kingston a few years ago attended one of the J-flag events. So tell me who would attend an event like Pride in Jamaica?
Yeah, so because most of our Pride events have been like either free or low cost, it's largely been community members. Of course, there have been some events where we've had specially invited guests. So we've had elected officials participate. We've also tried to kind of tailor our Pride activities in a range of ways. So we don't have a march, even though a march has been done through Montego Bay Pride, which is done in October, around our Heroes Day weekend celebrations, and that's organized by a different organization and activists. What we do in the August period is a range of activities to cater to different members of the community. And so one of the activities that we've had in the past, for example, was a trade show. So we have members of the community who own businesses to, ply their wares, and we have those kind of conversations about queer entrepreneurship. We've had conferences and discussion for in the past. We've had parties, of course. We've had family days, health fairs. So it's a multiplicity of activities to kind of cater to the range of people in the community who want to see themselves represented in Pride. So it's mostly community-based. Our bigger events are our sports days. So, sports days are a big thing in Jamaica. So you're going to school, you're either in the red house, blue house, green house, yellow house. And, as you go in school, you cheer for your specific sports team. So we usually kick off Pride with a sports day. And that's a way to get the community charged because, we have a cheerleading competition. So persons have to practice. So you build a momentum. There's netball, there's football. Well, football, as we understand it, soccer.
Soccer, yeah.
So, athletics, because that's a big part of who we are in Jamaica.
Yeah.
And so we have sports day that generates great interest, and then we have a beach day that or a river day that generates big interest for island people. We love the water. Yes,
Me too.
and
Me
and
too.
then usually we've toyed with different events for like the final event. So we've had the breakfast party, which I know is not necessarily a concept that everybody's familiar with, but just picture it, and I always have fun explaining this to people. It's you're partying at 7 to about 11 a.m. Alcohol, breakfast food. It works. So and now breakfast party, we've had dancehall artists perform at these events. All women so far. We've had prominent DJs in dancehall, which is a popular genre in Jamaica, perform as well to kind of also bridge the gap. And we've also had a faith celebration as well. So we've had allies in the church community come and create a space for LGBT persons of faith as well within that context, because we know within our context those communities exist and ought to be catered to as best as possible.
I know that a lot of the LGBTQ rights movements in the Caribbean are quite connected, and there's a lot of interaction and support and collaboration. Do folks from other islands, say Barbados or St. Lucia or St. Vincent and the Grenadines and other countries, do they come to Jamaica to support the events that y'all put on, or is it more just like an organic Jamaican celebration?
So persons have come. So I remember one year in particular, there were some persons in Bahamas that participated, and then they later kickstarted their Pride a few years after that. And then Trinidad has a month-long Pride. So they have because they have multiple active LGBT rights organizations and community-based organizations. So they have a month of activities. I happened to be there in Trinidad while in one of their Pride Month celebrations. And I was just shocked. I was like, a month? Y'all partying for a month? Yes. But Trinidad is also the home of soca. And funny enough, soca is a big space, a big queer space in the Jamaican context. Queer people love soca, and soca spaces tend to be a bit more inclusive. So we show up a lot in those spaces as well. So those are that a lot of queer people go to before we get to Pride. And so, Trinidad has that. So there has been persons showing up at our Pride. We have been to their Prides at different points. I remember Javian and Suel once, who are colleagues of mine. Well, Javian has now left us officially, but Suel is actually, they went to Bermuda Pride and had a good time there. Yeah. So there's that exchange. There's a Pride. There are multiple Caribbean Pride WhatsApp groups. There's actually a Caribbean Pride's website that we're rolling out so that we can sell, merchandise with, Pride paraphernalia from the particular islands. And so if you're in the diaspora, you're from Trinidad and you want to celebrate Trinidadian Pride, then you buy the merch there. If you want to celebrate with Bahamian Pride, you do that, and so forth and so forth. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that exchange happens. We're in constant communication. I think the Caribbean LGBT rights activists, we're close-knit because we see each other a lot in multiple spaces, and so we are always having these kinds of conversations.
And do you get any support from, say, the U.S. Embassy in Kingston? I know, maybe not under the Trump administration per se, but certainly under the Obama administration, there was a lot of public
discussion. We actually had support under both administrations.
Oh, really? Really? I didn't. Yeah.
So I remember in 2018, the Pride launch party was held at the residence of the ambassador.
Really? Wow.
In Jamaica, right? Yeah, so we were very fortunate, and my birthday is the day before Pride in Jamaica, so it was
Oh well, happy early birthday.
right. So that was nice. I remember one Pride they lit up their embassy lights, so they lit up their embassy in rainbow colors. And we've had like USA funding support certain Pride activities in the past as well. So we've got that support, not regardless of administration, and we've been very fortunate. With that, of course, the flying of the flag did happen in the, I think, the Obama administration. So the support kind of varies based on the, how the administration wants to be positioned around these issues. But it's been consistent in different ways, and we've been very, grateful for that. And they've continued to support us, and that relationship is ongoing.
I was speaking with Alexis DeMarco in the Bahamas recently, and she was very, very excited to tell me that the embassy in the Bahamas for the first time rose the Pride flag last month. And just the message that sent to LGBTQ folks in the Bahamas was just really important. Talk about the message that sends in Jamaica, to LGBTQ folks in Jamaica when they see the U.S. Embassy, acknowledging Pride Month, they're raising the Pride flag. Just talk about what that means to folks on the island in Jamaica when something so public is done to acknowledge Pride Month.
Well, it's a nuanced issue because one of the difficulties when you're in this context as people of color, predominantly people of color, with a history of colonialism and imperialism, sometimes when foreign governments are a bit strong on these issues, then LGBT issues become framed as foreign imposition. But I think, and I was having this conversation with another ambassador, that when it happens within the context of our Pride celebrations, so not necessarily in the general Pride Month in June, but when it's happening in solidarity and in complementarity with what we are doing locally, then that support sends a very clear message around, about the society that we're in and about that LGBT people belong. So I think it definitely has a place, but that has to be very strategic. And so it has to be done in conversation with representatives of the local community, because I think silence doesn't help, but also that doesn't mean that doing something visible is always helpful, right? So it has to be tailored to be helpful in particular contexts and in particular moments. And I think the best way, that's my view, is when you've had the conversation with the local persons and they said, yes, do it at this stage because, we are doing this, and then it would show that we have your support at this moment in time, rather than doing it off your own volition. And then it looks like, oh, you're just pushing this agenda, which is the word that they like to use, within our context. So yeah, I think that collaboration makes it even more impactful as opposed to being seen in very negative undertones.
And as we talk about Pride Month, and you obviously know this, Glenroy, but Jamaica is one of the countries in which consensual same-sex sexual relations remain criminalized. And I know that there's certainly been a movement on the island in recent years to try to change that. So can you update us about that situation, and what is the direct impact of that, the colonial era sodomy law, the buggery law as it's known in Jamaica? What's the day-to-day impact that law has on LGBTQ folks on the island?
So once again, this kind of answer it's very complicated. So the reality is, just based on the data that we've collected, and we're updating that data to make sure it's right, the laws aren't being strictly enforced against members of the LGBT community. So to be clear, the laws criminalize same-sex intimacy between men only, not between like women, for example.
Okay.
The laws aren't necessarily being enforced in that direct way, but it does send a signal about our lives and our bodies, and that to some people that our oppression, our exclusion, and our discrimination is okay. And so the problematic for that reason, beyond the kind of direct, oh, these laws are being used in this particular way, but we have had cases in the past where rogue police have blackmailed members of the community because they said it's either you pay me money or um, I will arrest and charge you for burglary. So there is that reality that the way the laws are crafted, that it does open up the LGBT community to abuse and to stigma and discrimination, a lot of times with impunity, and it does kind of craft a culture of distrust. But we have never been deterred by the existence of laws from being bold and stepping out and claiming space. I think because we live in a context or come from a context where laws have always been a problem for us as colonial peoples. Whether it was a law validating slavery, whether it was a law validating excluding certain kinds of women, certain children born out of wedlock, for example, we as laws have never necessarily had the most mutually reinforcing of relationships. And so we don't necessarily look to the laws to decide how we operate, even though we're very mindful of how they may be used against us. And so it doesn't stop us from doing the work that we do. It doesn't stop us from pushing for changes in all sorts of ways, but it definitely does not help when you want to push for, when you want to raise other issues like, addressing discrimination in various sectors, for example. And so we continue to agitate for that change because even though more of us are becoming visible, it's still a reality that we have to contend with. And I think the symbolic presence of that law is a crutch for some people. And you removing that crutch is one step in getting us to a better place. But we still do other kinds of work. And I think Pride does a really good job of that other part, which is getting people used to LGBT persons, showing people, for example, that dancehall, which has been seen as exclusively a homophobic genre, which is very popular in Jamaica, has been a place where LGBT people cannot exist. Pride has been a space where we show them that as LGBT Jamaicans, we love dancehall just the same in all of its problems, and that we have a way more, nuanced relationship with the genre, and it helps diversify the image of LGBT persons in Jamaica. And so the more people are proud and the more people show out, it sends a positive message throughout society. And I think finally it gives hope to a lot of people growing up. So when I, was younger and growing up, I wasn't seeing Pride happening. I wasn't seeing these kinds of activities. I wasn't seeing visible LGBT people. And so I didn't know what was possible. And now being a part of this work, showing people what is possible, is also an empowering thing so that they can add their voices and they can create space, and so that persons can begin to recognize that as a community, we are very much not going anywhere, and we're very much a part of the society and have always been. And I think Pride, given how we do it, given how we kind of marry it to Jamaican identity unapologetically, helps with that message.
And can you give us an idea just where things stand in terms of efforts to repeal the anti-buggery law? Do you expect that to actually happen soon? Give us kind of where do things stand on that effort in Jamaica in terms of politics or the courts or whatever?
So there is a case that is ongoing now by an activist, Maurice Tomlinson, who's challenging the laws in courts. There's some issues there because we have in our constitution what we call savings law clauses, which act as barriers. So what they do is that they say any law that existed before our constitution came into force, our constitution is valid and can't be challenged for violating rights. So the case persists. It's been going on for quite some time, I will admit, and even now I'm wondering, this is taking a while. But that is happening. But we're also doing the ongoing advocacy. So at JFLAG, we've done submissions to Parliament when they were reviewing the Sexual Offences Act and the Offences Against the Persons Act, where buggery is criminalized, and we've made recommendations there, and we continue to push for changes to those laws. So now, based on the report of the Committee of Parliament, they've kind of left it up to the wider Parliament to decide. So it's about kind of building those ongoing relationships and keeping that conversation going. I think the more we have the conversation is that the more we've seen a softening of positions, right? And the more we kind of get people to understand that these laws are not just bad for the LGBT community, it's bad for us as a people because of how they work. It gets us an inch closer. So we continue to do that work and to share that information. So we're doing research now, as I said, to kind of update how these laws are being implemented, to kind of also show that within the region between when we last did this research paper, which was around 2016, and now 5 years, it's been 5 years, a lot has changed in the region. And so this is definitely the direction that we should be going in, because Jamaica is oftentimes seen as a leader in the region. And so being, being kind of wedded to these laws doesn't always look good in Jamaican parlance for government, for politicians. And so, we continue. It's ongoing, but we continue that in a broader way. So we're looking at also, while we're having that conversation, promoting anti-discrimination legislation, working with parliamentarians who are willing and other like policymakers who are willing to put protective legislation in place where we can, even as we have that very difficult conversation. Because what we've recognized is that because of how it has been discussed in the years, it's almost like Jamaican identity has become tied to the anti-sodomy laws, and now we're trying to do the work of decoupling that and saying, well, I don't know that that's our identity, and so it's finding ways to do that decoupling. That's also part of the work that we're doing.
It almost sounds like y'all are trying to kind of reclaim Jamaican identity in some ways, and kind of prove that not all is bad in Jamaica, maybe.
So both. So absolutely. So we firmly recognize that, or we've noticed, like, because JFAG has been around for over 20 years, and I did a recent presentation looking at our history, and actually where we started, if we look at the movement, which has lasted over 40 years. So when Lawrence Chan wrote his letter to the editor claiming gay liberation within the Jamaican context, he was using this same approach of, shoring up Jamaican identity, celebrating Jamaican identity within the context of queer liberation. And so what we've really done is gone back to that approach. So one thing that they did, and I read this wonderful article the other day by a historian named Matthew Chin, who was looking at gay freedom movement and the work they were doing. They used to have John Kunu, and John Kunu was it's a celebration that we do around Christmas. It's inspired by African spiritualism and a little bit of Christianity. It's very syncretic in that way. And they had a John Kunu themed party back in the 70s.
Wow.
To kind of, it was a part of that work of saying, we are here, we are part of your society. You're making all of these changes because the 70s were a very revolutionary period for Jamaica. We should be a part of this. And so we've gone back to that kind of approach. And I think we've definitely seen incremental steps, very slow, I'll admit, but some incremental steps in getting us to where we need to be. I think because we've had to deal with the notion that queerness is not Jamaicanness or queerness is not blackness, and I think when you speak to like people of color, queer people of color, you hear that narrative a lot. So we're doing that work of saying, but it is very black. Black people have been queer for years, and it's a part of that work. And Jamaican have been queer people for years. Queer people have been Jamaican for years, and honoring that and celebrating that, because then you begin to demystify and disturb these very dominant narratives that have been perpetuated by a lot of times our opponents.
One thing I wanted to ask you about as well, Glenn Roy, is, and we've covered this not only in Jamaica but around the world, Latin America. This is certainly an issue in Africa, countries like Botswana, South Africa, the Philippines. I'm sure this is an issue as well. Is that there's this reality that anti-LGBTQ folks from the U.S. come to places like Jamaica to, for a lack of a better description, peddle their hatred. We covered that in Jamaica, specifically with the anti-buggery law in recent years. Is that still an issue in Jamaica? And if so, how do you and your colleagues try to counter these folks who are coming from the United States to peddle what they peddle? Talk about that situation if you could.
Well, so a couple of things. So it's very that. So when I talk about the early years of LGBT advocacy, I talk about what we call the golden age of advocacy, the gay freedom movement and the work they did up to the early 80s. And then after that, in the 80s, a lot of things were happening. As we know, the HIV epidemic, mushroomed during that period, and that kind of also shaped people's attitudes towards the community globally as well as locally. The community also had to start responding more directly to that. There was an upsurge in political violence in Jamaica. And what we also noticed that there was also an increase in those persons that you're referring to, evangelists from America coming into the Jamaican space to kind of peddle their ideas of what Christianity should look like. And a lot of that had been happening. And so that kind of aided the kind of dramatic increase in the late 80s, early 90s, throughout the 90s, early 2000s of kind of a specific strain of homophobia in Jamaica that we're now moving away from. But we still have to deal with, like, I call them extremist religious groups in Jamaica that push this narrative that being queer is anti-Jamaican, that being queer is nihilistic, all these kind of outlandish narratives. I think what we've been fortunate with over the years is they've not, I think there's been a kind of slowing down of their public engagement, and that doesn't mean they're not working privately. So they're not saying as much as they used to. They're not whipping up into a frenzy as much as they used to in the
Why
past.
Why do you think that is? Is it because their message is not as receptive and people aren't?
Yeah, because I think Jamaicans, at the end of the day, we have all our problems, that I think after a while, preaching kind of exclusion for a long period of time becomes tiring. I also felt like they made some very critical missteps. So as I said, Carnival is big in Jamaica, and they went for Carnival and said it was lewd and inappropriate. And yeah, I think there was some wind lost out of their steam there. And then after a while, I think also as we kind of shifted what we were saying, as we kind of became more nuanced, as we became more clear in that we're in talking about inclusion and talking about recognizing our rights as LGBT Jamaicans to be a part of the society that we're born in, then the message that they were peddling became less resonant, because now it wasn't them standing up for Jamaica, and they did latch on to that notion of standing up for Jamaica against foreign interference. And so us kind of taking some of that frame and saying, well, actually, our motto is out of many one people, that must mean us. And we actually created some shirts that kind of played on that one of many out people. And so once we kind of, and there was the We Are Jamaicans campaign that was launched in 2013 that also helped with putting faces to the LGBT community. I think once we were doing more of that and showing up as Jamaican people that they could relate to, that had very relatable stories of growing up in the country or growing up in the city, and catching Piniwali, which is just it's a Jamaican word for fireflies, and having those very relatable Jamaican stories, then a lot of the narratives they were leading with kind of become less believable. And I think it definitely helped in shifting the kind of sway they had in the public conversation. And we've also engaged the media to improve how they discuss these issues as well. And we're now actually releasing a media guide to help persons in the media to do even better than they've already done, so that they can understand that even as you're trying to be balanced, that sometimes you have to be mindful of the language that we use. So we've done that work as well to kind of improve. And actually, the Press Association of Jamaica has some very clear guidelines that I didn't even know about until we started doing this work with the media, that says you don't mention someone's sexual orientation unless it's absolutely necessary for a story. So they already started doing that work. And I think that came with the engagement and the conversation that had been happening. So I think they've become they've started to look more extremist than they originally seemed. But I think they're very much still active in kind of much more quiet and targeted and calculating ways that we just always have to be prepared for. And so to combat that, we have to build a relationship so that when we recognize that they are acting in these kind of subversive ways, that we're able to respond.
You mentioned the media a couple minutes ago, and I remember when I first started covering Jamaica, probably 15 plus years ago, I would read the Jamaica Gleamer. I just remember that in my head. Their headlines were just absolutely horrifying. Again, defamatory, salacious, everything. And we've seen that in Uganda. We've seen that in Ghana with the situation going on there. So it sounds like, some of the media, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like the media coverage from what you're saying is getting a little bit better. And I suspect that also has an impact on how folks perceive LGBTQ folks on the island.
Absolutely. So we actually did a media content analysis around late last year to kind of see what that looks like in terms of, we kind of noticed it anecdotally and we wanted to see what the data was showing. So we looked at the articles, the actual content of the articles, the headlines. So what we noticed is that there still would be, in some instances, like grabbing headlines. And so some of those would be very problematic language, but the content became more neutral and positive. And so it's kind of getting them to understand that you can have really good content and you still don't need those kind of clickbait headlines that kind of go with them. But no, we've definitely seen an improvement. And I think one key lesson that we recognize is that engagement was critical. So us as LGBT actors doing two things, us adding more voices to the conversation, whether it is to submitting letters to the editors and op-eds and stuff like that, but also us being willing to show up when they call us and show up in multiple ways. I think sometimes as LGBT activists, we have a tendency to only talk about hardcore LGBT issues. And I've learned in doing this work that you show up. I could be talking about, I mostly these days, because my background is in law, I talk about constitutional law issues. So I'm on the radio talking about governance. But you know who I am, and you know I'm an LGBT advocate, and you would see me talking about these issues from time to time. But I've become known as a voice on governance, and that helps as well to kind of see me as an LGBT person in a more nuanced and broader way. And then you begin to kind of question, do I need to have these kind of negative associations towards this person whose sexual identity is part of him, but not the only part of him that matters, right? And then why do I even have these biases in the first place if it affect me? So yeah, we recognize that we also had to kind of shift our media engagements in certain ways to kind of help the media along and just be willing to engage, show up, answer their questions, and give them positive feedback. And so we have the media guides that we'll be sending out. And I remember one of the last radio interviews I did, the person who was talking said, listen, I know my language isn't there. As soon as these are printed, make sure my radio station gets on. And that was very affirming to hear, So there is that interest. And I recognize now, especially with like within the students coming up, there is a great appetite for LGBT stories. And so a lot of times at J5, we get students doing way more LGBT related research for their undergraduate programs, their graduate programs. And so we have to also be in that place to support them because we can also recognize our role in knowledge creation in a space where that isn't there.
A few more questions before we wrap it up. And, thank you for bearing with our technical issues. It's really wonderful to, get a one-on-one discussion about Jamaica. I think a lot of our readers are very interested in what's going on the island. The tourism industry is obviously a huge industry in Jamaica, and there's been calls in previous years to boycott the island, boycott Jamaican rum, among other things. So I'm just wondering, as we talk about Pride Month and Pride celebrations, has the tourism industry, especially, the hotels and resorts and all of the other businesses that cater to them, have they stepped up and publicly acknowledged Pride in any way, or have they done so in the past? Can you give an overview about what the tourism industry is doing in Jamaica to not only acknowledge Pride, but to support the work that J-Flag and other folks are doing on the island?
So what I will say is that over time, the hotels that we've engaged have become better. You know, the more whether it is we have like work events there, they become better and understanding. I think the tourism industry on a whole is a bit hesitant. We've engaged them in the past to kind of see how they can start to support our pride and kind of recognize the value in supporting our pride to kind of promote Jamaica as a pride destination and to kind of, because I think we all in the Caribbean we have very unique pride experiences, and I think it's definitely something worth sharing. And I think there's that hesitancy there, but we don't, you know, the conversation is still ongoing. And so it's work that we continue to do to kind of get them to understand that there is value there that you do not want to miss. But I also kind of want to just address, because it's something that does come up, and I've heard it multiple times in different fora about, you know, boycotting as an approach. So two things. One, I don't know that it sends the message that you think it sends, because you boycotting is just going to look like external interference. And as I said, as a people who are very sensitive to colonial that doesn't read well, and we will double down on our Jamaican identity if you try and push us in a direction that we are taking our time to get to. It's just a Jamaican thing. Don't force me. If you force me, it's not gonna go well. But I think on the more granular level, the tourism industry is a major employer of LGBT persons.
Right, as it is throughout the Caribbean, not just in Jamaica.
Right. I remember with me and my colleagues were at a hotel for work, and that's where we had a lot of trainings with like service providers. And you know, in the evening they were having a talent show, but we were just there, you know, vibing. It was karaoke night, and me and my friends, we were just, you know, we're having a good time, we're dancing, you know, in our own very visibly queer ways. And I mean, WAP was playing, so me and my friend was ready to do our WAP TikTok dance, and we did it up to a point, and then what we saw was so beautiful. Like one of the members of staff, who is, well, I can't presume that he's queer, but seemingly queer, presumably queer, he continued that dance after. And so he's dancing and gyrating and all of that. And it just kind of felt good to see that we have gotten to a space in Jamaica where you can be at work in the tourism industry as a man and feel comfortable enough to do feminine identified moves, which usually is heavily kind of scrutinized within the Jamaican context. And I think that's a testament to where we go. And so if you punish the tourism industry, then what you're doing is that young man who has a safe space at work now, seemingly, you're taking away his safe space and taking away his ability as well to support himself in his community where it may not be as safe. And so we have to kind of think about who is really impacted, because the first thing, once the profits drop, the first person that is cut is the service staff, and that's where LGBT people are. And so if you really want to help us as a people, it's, if you're working in a multinational, find out what your local body is actually doing. So because there are many multinationals operating, not just in Jamaica, but across the Caribbean, do you have the policy? Are you engaging the local LGBT community there? How are you supporting their pride? So things like that. And we're seeing more of that happening now. A couple private sector entities have reached out to us to say, well, we are having pride activities. Do you have any materials? Do you have any resources? Will someone come and speak at our event? And that's what we want. And I think if you want to support us, then push for that kind of dialogue and engagement. So do that work at the back end, so that when we request meetings from our end, we're more likely to get a yes to do that part of the work. I think that is more beneficial than trying to directly push for something in a context that you are not familiar with, that you don't have the sensitivities in navigating, and that your identity will be just used against you, no matter how well intentioned you are.
One question I wanted to ask you too, Glenroy. Vice President Kamala Harris, her father is from Jamaica originally. I don't know, she doesn't talk about her father that much, but there's certainly a cultural connection with her in Jamaica. And she in the Biden administration, as you know, are publicly championing global LGBTQ rights. Is there a role that the vice president could play in further advancing LGBTQ issues in Jamaica? Like if she were to come visit the island, or, give me your thoughts on that.
So actually, so I think there are two opportunities. So I think it would be good, a visit can always be useful to kind of see what can benefit from it. I remember when President Obama came to Jamaica, and he started his Young Leaders of America's initiative.
There's a famous picture of the rainbow coming off air when photo with the rainbow in Kingston on Air Force One. It's such an emblematic photo, but I digress.
When he spoke about Angeline Jackson, who was a person doing advocacy. So, I mean, that will always help, I think, in just kind of when you have, especially a leader of color coming into your context, and she, unlike President Obama, has that heritage. There can be more opportunities for connection. So, her engaging the community, just her being here and having those kinds of conversations can be very useful in kind of pointing the missions in the kind of direction that they should go, even though, as I said, we've been very fortunate to have a good relationship with the mission here in Jamaica. But the other thing that I think is critical, and that I think is a bit more maybe controversial, is her kind of more looking at asylum processes and what they look like, because the reality is there are many LGBT people in Jamaica who, because of their experiences of violence and discrimination and displacement especially, their experiences of persecution, essentially, they look for opportunities elsewhere because Jamaica just can't work for them. Some of us, like myself, are fortunate because of our intersectional identities and privileges, but that's not everybody. And to then leave that space and go into the American space that has its own challenges and have to deal with sometimes what can be an unfriendly asylum system that can sometimes be dehumanizing, is something that I think, if you're also committed about LGBT rights within the Jamaican context, something that you can't leave out of the conversation. How are you treating the people that you're supposedly saving, from the context that they're in? While you're supporting the people in that context to improve that context, how are you treating those people? What message are you sending about the lives you claim to value when you come here, when those lives and those bodies get there, that valuing is not demonstrated in the policies, in the support that is provided, in the ways in which asylum is granted, in what is the standard of proof that is required, those kinds of things. And I think that's a conversation that I keep raising, because I feel, and I raise with multiple governments, not just the US, because I feel like it's missed, right? And because we as an entity don't necessarily do work on asylum processes, we focus on what's happening locally, but we're aware of what happens because we know persons who have, sought asylum elsewhere. We talk to organizations who are based in those spaces and understand the difficulties that happen. And so, because we can't really do that kind of work there, I think, and since immigration is such a big ticket issue in America, I think that's an opportunity.
Two more questions to wrap it up, and you've been so incredibly generous with your time, so thank you. Makes me want to come to Jamaica, I must tell you. And do
absolutely. Sure. Once we have a good pride, you should come. I'll set you up real nice.
I like that idea of having the party on the beach. That's totally my scene. Y'all better
you have not lived until you had a breakfast party, I'm telling you.
Absolutely. I look forward to it. And give me some nice coffee too while I'm down there, and we'll be
coffee and rum.
Yes. We'll be friends for life, I assure you. So just to wrap it up, I just lost my I'm getting transfixed on Jamaican coffee and rum. So I just thought I just remembered the question. So as we mark Pride Month, what lessons can the LGBTQ movement in Jamaica teach their brothers and sisters around the world, like Botswana, the Philippines? What lessons can folks around the world learn from the work that y'all are doing in Jamaica? What lessons can they take from everything that y'all are doing down there?
Well, so what I will say is this, because I oftentimes feel like there is a there's a belief that there's one way to pride, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't necessarily subscribe to that belief. I've been fortunate enough to live in the UK for a year while I was studying. And I remember going to two major Pride events. I went to Pride in London, which is, the traditional march. And that was lovely for what it was. It was nice, it was affirming. But I'm a queer person of color. And so when I went to UK Block Pride, and it was basically a block party, it was basically a cookout, right? And I was hearing dancehall music. I was seeing representation from all sorts of people of color in that space. That felt like home to me. And I feel like particularly different, in the global south, as we begin to shape what our pride events look like. Yeah, absolutely. See what has worked within the US context. But if we're going to be very fair to the US context, Pride happened following Stonewall.
Right.
That march has a socio-political and historical context.
Stonewall Pride started as a riot, right? That's what everybody said.
Yeah. It has that context and it makes sense, and therefore it must happen in that way there. And I will never take that away from them. We don't necessarily at this stage do this kind of activism in this way in the parts of the world that we are. And so therefore we have to then think about what resonates with us here. It may be a march. Maybe you do identify with a march. Maybe that does work for you. I think my suggestion would be, let's do a road march since we do that for soca. So let's present it like that. Let's present it like a road march soca party and see how that works. That's closer to home. And I think that will resonate more because I think because Pride's job is twofold. It's one, building community, providing hope, getting people to feel like they belong to something, but also it's the job to be unapologetically present and visible in the space that you are in and saying, I am here and I'm proud of who I am despite all you have put me through. I think that part of the message has to resonate. And I think also to kind of recognize that the people that you're serving are people in your own communities that they want the experiences that for some of them that resonate with them. And I think when we see like how people get invested in sports day, for example, we see the quality of the cheerleading that is done. Like they run that cheerleading competition like a boot camp. And that shows that there's interest and there's passion there. And I don't know that we would have gotten that at that stage with a march. I mean, we might get there, and that might be something, like I said, maybe a road march with some big Zuki trucks. There are special trucks that play music as you go down. Maybe that will work because that looks Caribbean, that looks Jamaican. And so that's my advice. Pride in your way, and don't be apologetic about that. Because we've had to deal with the critiques that, our pride is not a real pride because it's not a march. And I said, okay, fine, it's not traditional, but it's Jamaican, and I think that's what matters.
Yeah. So you kind of have to adapt it to what the reality is on the ground and what folks are looking to do. And just to wrap it up, Glenroy, how can our readers support you and your JFly colleagues and the work that you're doing? How can we continue to support that work?
Well, I think, once the world is free and good and open, I think, come here and learn about the context, learn more and exchange more if you are able to donate. I mean, the difficulty now is figuring out our donations. But once we have that, our system, if you can, donate, then do that. If you work in entities, like I said, if you work in multinationals, make those linkages. If you work in donor agencies, bring up these opportunities to engage us. But I think the most important step is to kind of learn about the context and engage people who live there and deepen your knowledge. I think sometimes we run with the predominant narrative that it has not necessarily been crafted by people or is not fully representative of the people that live there. And I think that's the best start. And then you can kind of figure out, how do I fit in within this context? What can I actively do here? How can I do my part? Is it by visiting? Is it by suggesting? Is it by connecting people? Is it by giving money? It can be a range of things. I think that's the best thing you can do. Just reach out, and we don't hide information. We'll tell you the good, the bad, the indifferent, and that's the best place to start.
Absolutely. And I think that's a wonderful way to leave it. Well, Glenroy, it's a real honor to talk with you, and happy Pride Month, or happy Pride, not just Pride Month, but Pride months and all year long. And keep us posted on how things are going in Jamaica. And I'm going to, just as a quick note to wrap it up to our viewers, I'll follow up with Hazel and Naomi, and we'll have additional videos and interviews with them. I apologize for the technical issues on their part, but technology is what it is sometimes, and we have no control over that. So, but Glenroy, thank you so much again, and to all of our readers, happy Pride, and we'll be in touch very soon.
Thank you for having me. Happy Pride.
You too, Glenroy. Talk to you soon.